Well, I feel like we watched this movie before to some extent, though. That is, before World War One, we saw with the rise of Germany that it effectively outgrew the British dominated system. So again, a shift of power. The British hegemon was declining. Germany as a regional power increased. So in 1871, for example, Britain produced twice as much steel as Germany, which was a good indicator of economic power. And 22 years later, by 1893, the German steel production had already then surpassed the British. And by the time World War One broke out in 1914, German steel production had doubled that of Britain. So that's a very short period of time for the whole relationship to be put on its head. Now, you can say power shifts up and down, but this is quite critical because the whole European security architecture then was still British dominated. So you have then Germany producing twice as much steel, yet all its major waterways, that is outside, internal in Germany, are patrolled and controlled by the British. It doesn't really make much sense. But it seems, after World War II, we saw the same. The Germans outgrew the the regional security architecture, and I was wondering, do you see this historical patterns? Because we have a similar thing now. I mean, the Chinese economy has been the biggest in the world in terms of purchasing power parity since 2014. While in Russia, we had after the Cold War, we decided let's develop a European security architecture where they wouldn't have a seat at the table because we thought they're weak. They're only going to get weaker. We're going to manage their decline. That would be the new Europe. So another Treaty of Versailles, essentially. So, but now we ended up in a situation where the Russians reversed, and now they have the largest state, the largest economy, territory, population, military. Yet they're supposed to be the only country in Europe which doesn't have a seat at the table. So all these red flags should be going up. I feel that this system is not going to produce stability but war. But yet again, we can't even discuss this. I mean, if you listen to the European politicians and their stenographers in the media, it's just, well, we have freedom and democracy, and Russia want empire, and then this is it. It's just a good old-fashioned good versus evil. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But do you see historical continuity on some other levels?
Look, I mean, for the past 20 years, Great Britain has been the chief instigator of wars throughout the world. You go back to World War One, and one of the great injustices of that war was that Germany was forced to accept all guilt for causing the war, when in fact you could argue that Britain had more to do with the cause of World War One than Germany did. Okay, and the reason why is that Britain subscribes to an idea called the Mackinder Heartland thesis. And the idea is that Britain is a small country with very little manpower, but it controls the seas. So in order to maintain its hegemony, it needs to create as much chaos and conflict within the Eurasian continent as much as possible, because if a major power to arise in the Eurasian continent, whether it be France or the Ottoman Empire or Germany or Russia, then it would unite the Eurasian continent by railway, and it would negate sea trade. And so Britain would collapse economically, militarily, demographically. And so for the past 20 years, Britain has been sowing as much chaos as possible throughout the Eurasian continent. So you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain sponsored, financed 7 major wars against France. Napoleon had basically conquered the continent by the Battle of Austerlitz. Austria and Russia were soundly defeated, but Britain was still working behind the scenes, financing wars, because Britain could not afford for France to consolidate Europe and create a continental system, which is what Napoleon wanted. And then you fast forward to Germany in the same situation. So Britain cannot allow any power to emerge in Eurasia. And today, America subscribes to the same concept where, as you say, there's a parallel between what happened before World War I between Britain and Germany, and now between China and America, where China is a manufacturing superpower and it needs all these resources from South America. And South America has something called the Lithium Triangle, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And that's about 50% of the world's lithium, which is crucial for EVs, for AI, for the future, basically. And so China has been invested heavily in South America, building roads, building infrastructure. There's this mega port that is building in Peru to facilitate trade. And South America has been very receptive and welcoming of Chinese investment. But America cannot allow China to continue to rise. And that's why America is going to use its sea power to disrupt global trade, right? So we've seen American troops boarding this Venezuelan oil tanker, but there was also this Chinese ship headed to Iran, and it was boarded as well. So this is this blatant piracy. America, for the past 50 years, says that we will defend global trade. And now America, in order to defend its empire, in order to weaken China and Russia, is now resorting to global piracy, basically.
What is interesting about the end of World War I, though, is every historian, well, more or less every historian recognizes that the Treaty of Versailles put in place at the end of the war set us on a path to a Second World War because it didn't create a sustainable place for Germany in the new Europe. However, if you would say that Germany was provoked to start World War II, then you're a Nazi sympathizer. So it's very strange because it's more or less the same thing. But I think it speaks to the mentality that if you recognize something, you acknowledge it, then you legitimize it. It just feels like we're a little bit back there at the moment because the Russian invasion, it couldn't possibly be more in the provoked. This was provoked in every way. But and you can easily prove this, but you're not allowed to say it because then you're legitimizing the invasion, and of course you have to be cancelled immediately. But I thought the Eurasian heartland comment was interesting, though. As you said, it derives to some extent from the Napoleonic system when they wanted to consolidate Europe, cut off the British as a maritime power, and then that would destroy them. So this kind of made the British convinced that you just have to keep the European powers divided. Of course, 120 years ago, this came into a more cohesive theory in terms of Mackinder. But in the 19th century, the British were fighting Russia as a potential hegemon of Eurasia. And in the 20th century, the American security strategists also referred to the heartland theory because they saw, they also saw them as the maritime power versus the Russian land power. But today, though, Eurasia is not hegemonic, and while the goal in the past was primarily to split the Russians from the Germans, always to push them out to Asia. This is why we did the Crimean War against the Russians as well in the mid-19th century. But now, when you push Russia into Asia, it doesn't push it into economic backwaters. It pushes it straight into the arms of the largest industrial power and technological power now in the world, which is China. At least one of the two. So it's a very different setting. So how do you assess this new Eurasia? I mean, one shouldn't overestimate the ability of them to harmonize their interests and work cohesively. But there is a commonality, though. The Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, I mean, the Iranians. Many of them have competing interests, but none of them wants to be dominated by a maritime power anymore. So how do you see this impacting? Or does it impact this path to World War III?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So, the Mackinder-Hartland thesis is something that's ascribed to both by the American Empire as well as the British Empire. And so what's happening is that because of American aggression, because this system, this financial system where the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, which gives America exorbitant privilege, which is say you can print as $30 trillion and not have to suffer anything, and the rest of the world has to absorb this debt. It's driving the BRICS countries and Iran into each other's arms. So the great nightmare for the Anglo-American Empire is an alliance between Russia, Iran, and China. And of course, India will also come into this alliance eventually at some point because it benefits India. And this creates the Eurasian trade continental system, right? And Iran is the key because Iran's the pivot, it's the center of the world. All these trade alliances run through Iran. So the Europeans have something called EMAC, the European, India, Middle East corridor. Russia has something called the North-South corridor. China, of course, has a Belt and Road initiative. So Iran is the key. And that's why America is intent on regime change in Iran. America cannot afford for this alliance to take shape, to manifest itself, because then America would lose trade access in the Eurasian continent. China, Russia, and Iran could just trade amongst themselves and then provide energy and food and manufactured goods to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe. And then America just stuck with $38 trillion in debt, and the America Ponzi scheme would collapse. So for this is a life and death struggle for America. So what it needs to do is go into Iran and make sure this alliance cannot take shape. It doesn't have to win the war, but it needs to create as much chaos as possible. And that's why I think in 2026, we'll see an escalation in rhetoric and conflict between America and Iran, with Israel as of course, as the pit dog for the American empire.